Here is Sailor Studio 683. I at first thought this was a very dark magenta, but the chromatography shows it definitely is a purple. The swatch shows sheen that I don't experience in the writing sample. Being very dark, there is no tone shift as paper changes, and there is no shading, making this a boring, predictable, beautiful ink. It does get deep into the non-fountain pen friendly paper, but doesn't feather or spread on them, letting the deep penetration become forgivable. This is such a unique tone on the page. I just loved using it and certainly wish I would receive a bottle of it. Then I would devour the hell out of using it up. This is such a great ink.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M120. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Such a deep, dark purple that it almost gets to that line of looking like it wants to be black. There is no feather, there is no spread, there is no shading at all. Just a beautiful, unique tone on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Studio 460. Here is Sailor Kobe number 46 Museum Gray. Here is Sailor Studio 131. Here is Sailor Studio 670.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
We can see here that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade, it does look fantastic on the page. Really, I can't stress enough how nice this ink was to use and how really unique this super dark purple looks to me. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does get incredibly deep, a lot all over the place. Now, while I could not write on the back of this page because of the extreme amount of ghosting, it does not bleed through, touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now, the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
We can see here that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading at all. Just great performance all the way through. What an amazing ink. Looking at the back of the page, we only see this one spot that it got a bit deep into the, or a bit deeper into the paper. It's got really minor ghosting, no bleeding at all, never touched the page underneath. Only that one spot occurs. So great performance right here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade, it does stand out very well against the quad rule. That quad rule really just disappears into the background as if it was not there in the first place. What a great ink to use if you take a lot of math notes the way that I do, and if you use quad rule, then it gets to go away. Looking at the back of the page, we see a couple of spots that it got deeper into the paper. Now, it's deeper, very minor ghosting except for those spots. I'd say that you could continue writing back here without any kind of real problem. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Ancient Charm, The Moon Over the Mountain Pass. Here is Aurora Purple. Here is Birmingham Pen Company, Allegheny River Twilight. Here is Private Reserve Purple Mojo.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, this paper has a tendency to really lighten it and dull the ink a bit. It didn't do it here. Very strong ink that doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade. Looks great. If you're a student using this, I'm bumping your grade by a few points. Not a whole letter, but just a couple of points for it. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem. Continuing all of those important notes back here.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Geherbon Vert Olive. Here is Pen BBS number 261. Here is Private Reserve Rose Rage. Here is Montagrappa Harry Potter Hufflepuff.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
We can see here that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't feather. It barely at all spreads, if at all. It doesn't shade. It looks fantastic on this paper. What a great ink to use if you have to use this paper on the regular. Real winner. Looking at the back of the page, as you would expect, it got quite deep into the paper. Lot of ghosting going on here, but nothing bled through, touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The very wet fine of this Pelikan M120 gives me a wonderful dark tone that I am in love with, even without the shading. Off camera, I tried this in a dry stub, and love isn't perfect. You must accept their faults, as the tone was much lighter and it did shade, but wasn't as enjoyable for me. Now, while the tone and the shading weren't bad from the dry stub, it just wasn't for me. That is why I recommend going with a wet fine or medium for this beautifully unique, dark, flat purple.